And one day she said to Paul and me, she wanted us to come to dinner. And Paul said, well, how shall we dress? And she said, oh, just casually. There's nobody but family. Now, Paul touched up the story at that point, as he was sometimes given to doing, just Gypsy Rose Lee and Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, and he get quite a list. Of course, none of those people were still there. They had been there, but they weren't there anymore. But Oliver Smith was there, and his one claim to fame, as far as I was concerned, was, well, two. One was the set for Rodeo, and the other was he owned Henry James's desk. And it was an astonishing piece of furniture, obviously made to order. No particular style, but it was large enough to cover, to hold a lot of manuscripts of Henry James, and that takes a pretty big desk. So we went, and we had a nice time. I had been there a good many times, and Carson was still then able to play the piano. The only time I ever heard her play the piano was there in George Davis's house, and she played very well, all Bach, nothing else. And I admired that because my two hands wouldn't do that. My right hand would play Bach, but my left hand refused.
Okay.
So...
Can you talk to us about Carson and Reeves?
Oh, yes. Carson and Reeves had been divorced at that point. And then later on, after Carson moved to Nyack to live with her mother, she and Reeves were reunited and married again. And they had up the second floor, and Beebe had the first floor. And one night they came in and told her they were going into New York for something that evening. Carson went upstairs to get dressed, and Reeves said, Mother, he called Mrs. Smith Mother, she said to him, said, Reeves, something I want to ask you. That I've been reading so many books about gay boys, and I just want to know, what do they do in bed? Well, he turned beet red and ran upstairs, and he came back with all 4 volumes of Havelock Ellis' The Psychology of Sex. And he said, I think you better look it up, Mother, while we're gone to New York. So when they got back, Carson went upstairs, and she said, and Reeves said to his mother-in-law, did you find out what you wanted to know? Well, the 4 books were down on the floor beside her, and she said, no, I decided I don't really want to know. So that was the education of Beebe. Yes, in that period, that was before he was a stowaway on the boat following Carson to Europe, and that was a disastrous trip. Dame Edith Sitwell invited him to a dinner party she gave for Carson at the Savoy, of all places. And he got so drunk he slid out of his chair and wound up on the floor under the table. And when they were leaving, Edith Sitwell said to the head waiter, you can return the body to such and such a hotel, and they left Reeves there. By this time, he had become a liability. I didn't like him at best, if you want my frank opinion, and I'll tell you the reason why. He was good looking, and at that point he was very good to Carson when I first knew him. But he was too bitter. I never like people that are that bitter. Now, judging by my own experience, it seems characteristic of American members of the Communist Party that they are all embittered people. I think that's why they become communists. It's not the other way around. He had a good job in New York later on when they lived with Beebe. And after they lived there a while, Carson bought the house from Beebe. So the house then became Carson's, and Beebe lived with them. Beebe was a dear, dear, angelic woman, wonderful. You think with her background to have been confronted with 3 children like those. It just astonishes me. Because she was my mother's generation, and deep South, very respectable. Then to move to New York and move into Carson's group of friends and fellow writers. But she got along with them, and they all liked her. But before I moved back to Macon in 1945, Carson and Reeves and Rita and a group of about 10 friends used to meet, and my boss, who ran an art gallery on 57th Street, he was in Mexico for the summer. So we would have meetings in his apartment. Now these were political rallies. I'm sure it all must be in a folder in the FBI, because it was somewhat pink, to put it mildly. Carson was completely apolitical. She was in favor of the downtrodden, but it knew no political aspect. But he was increasingly embittered as the years went on, and by the time that they moved to France, of course, he was dangerous. She came finally to realize that and just barely escaped with her life. I know many people that said it was because he was a frustrated writer and that he had sacrificed his writing career to his wife. Now, as far as I know, he was incapable of writing anything except a letter. His letters to Carson are good. They're good letters, but it takes more than letter writing to be a creative author. I don't think he had any talent. Now, the one that did have talent and did sacrifice her own talent to Carson's was Rita Smith, Carson's sister. She published some very good stories, but after Carson's very first illness, everything was sacrificed to taking care of Carson. They didn't get along very well together, but that didn't stop Rita from doing what she thought she ought to. And she commuted every weekend to Nyack, go up and see how Carson was. One time, when Bebe was still alive, Paul and I went up there, and this was at this time Rita was still an alcoholic, and she got so drunk she passed out, and 2 men bodily carried her up the steps and put her on the bed. And her mother said, "Poor little, not sister, that's what she called Carson. I've forgotten now what she called
Baby.
Rita. Baby, maybe. Poor baby. She just works so hard down there at that office. When she comes home, she just passes out from fatigue." Now, whether she believed this or not, I don't know. People argue as to. She was not a naive woman, so I don't think she believed that. Later on, Rita went on the wagon and didn't take another drink for something like more than 15 years. But that didn't mean that she didn't have all kinds of phobias. She had more phobias than anyone I've ever met. And one of them was that she couldn't ride in elevators. So again, Ian Smith invited Rita and me to dinner one night in Brooklyn Heights. Well, we got off the subway. She wouldn't even get on subways unless there was someone to hold her hand all the time she was on the subway. We got off the subway underneath the St. George Hotel. Now, the subway there is deeper below the surface of the ground than any other subway in America, possibly in the world. And you have to get on an elevator and go up to the street level, which is in the lobby of the St. George Hotel. She said, "Now we'll have to walk up." I said, "Really, you know how many flights it is? Doesn't matter. I'm not going to get in that elevator." So we opened the door, and the staircase, which was sort of circular stair, was in the room with all the turbines, and it really looked like a Piranesi prison scene. And I looked up, realized how many flights up it was, and she said, now you go up there and see if the door is open, because it wouldn't do much good if we could both go up there and find out that you can't get out, you can only get in. Well, I didn't stop to examine the logic of that, but I walked up. And when I got up there, the door was open, or would open. So I screamed down the stairwell to come on up. So she pulled herself up all those steps. And when we got ready to go, I said, now Rita, we're going to take a taxi back to Manhattan, and we're going to split the cost. I'm not going and walk down those steps at the St. George again. All right, we'll take a taxi, which is what we did. And Carson in the hospital would love for me to tell her, oh, what Bibi called Rita Smith was Little Pretty. But of course it was, with her accent, it was Lil, L-I-L, Pretty, P-U-D-Y, P-U-T-Y. So Carson would want me to tell her about stories about Rita and the elevators. And so another time I went by to pick her up. This was when she worked for Red Book, and their offices were on about the 15th floor of that building that's just above in the Pan Am building, just above Grand Central Station. And she would not get in the elevator coming down or going up unless it was full of people that also worked in the same office for protection. And I said, Rita, what's this big problem with the elevator? She said, I'm afraid they'll stop between floors and I can't get out. I said, well, I lived in New York for 30 years or more, and I've never been in an elevator that stopped between floors. She said, well, it's happened to me twice. So, well, you know, you haven't got much answer for that. About that time, the elevator came down that we would have gotten into, and it stopped about 3 feet above the floor. And there were two men in there. One of them had a knife and was trying to kill the other one. And the one that was about to be